Then, well, all right, okay, let's get started. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here and bearing with the odd technology issues. Obviously, Mac and Microsoft still hate each other, so we'll move forward anyway. I guess we'll get started. I'll start by talking about myself, just a brief introduction. My name is Dylan Secord, and my side name is Dee on the top of my head, and it's an honor, and I'm humbled to be here with you. Cheryl Myers. I'm thrilled that she has invited us to be here today. So Cheryl's going to help me during my presentation because I really want to include her life experiences because obviously she's one of your coworkers and colleagues. So I think it's very important to get her viewpoint and her life experience as a deaf person. So I'll be including her. So before I get started, I'm really curious. Well, I guess I just need to tell you a little bit more about myself. I'm a clinical social worker and I work for DEFCAN, Deaf Community Advocacy Network. I'm a full-time therapist and also I do a lot of administration work as well at DEFCAN. I teach part-time at Oakland Community College and I teach in their interpreter training program. So really, I am excited to be here today. And before I dive into my presentation today, I want you to feel free at any time to interrupt me, anytime at all. If you have any burning questions or you don't understand what's going on, I am very open to your questions at any time. So actually, I want to make this presentation feel very interactive. You know, it's tough sometimes in the virtual world, but I think we can make it happen today. I do. Okay, any questions before we get started? Okay, I guess not. Oh, this is Cheryl speaking. If anybody has any questions, just go ahead and raise your hand. Thank you. Dylan says, okay, great, perfect. Thanks so much. Cheryl's going to help me monitor if someone raises their hands. If someone raises their hand, Cheryl's going to let me know. So great, thank you. Sherry has a question.
So I don't really have a question. I just want to say as we get started, I just love the title. I'm just very excited to learn all about what this title implies. So I just wanted to tell you that it was a very good title to catch our attention. So, and I hope everything goes very smoothly today. Thank you for coming.
Oh, no problem at all. I love your energy. Thanks for joining us today. That's perfect. Thank you. I'm happy to hear that. So the slides are really, it's really important for you to understand the outdated language. Please, please, please don't use any of the antiquated terminology like deaf mute, deaf and dumb, hearing impaired. All of these are very old terms, and those three terminologies are very offensive to deaf people, so don't use those words anymore. I'm encouraging you to use, instead of those, 4 different words that are culturally respectful, politically correct terminology. So we use deaf, hard of hearing, deafblind, and hearing loss. Yep, a 5th one could be deaf disabled. Yep, so those are 5 appropriate terms that we use now. Those 5 terms look at us as a whole because the other antiquated terms look at something in the aspect of something being missing or broken in us, and that's not true. We're more than that. We have our community, we have our culture, we have our language, so make sure to use the proper terminology when referring to deaf people. Cheryl, I have a question for you. If people are talking with you, how do you want people to identify you? Do you want them to say deaf, or what? How do you want them to refer to you? Cheryl says, I want them to refer to me as deaf. Thank you, Cheryl. Okay, yep, so Cheryl says she's deaf. The other thing that we see here is in the year 2016, our former governor, Snyder, signed into effect saying that all laws, all policies in the state of Michigan should stop using any of the antiquated, outdated language. So can you imagine that? 2016, 4 years ago, hearing people finally realized that they should call us by the appropriate verbiage. So I'm encouraging you, people who are working in your organizations, to review all of your policies, all of your flyers, all of your posting, and make sure to use the proper terminology. Okay.
All right, so today we're going to talk about the meaning of deafness. It means any person who has a lot of hearing loss, and that amount of hearing loss would require that deaf person to use various kinds of communication modes. So for example, they might use lip reading, they might use gesture, they might use sign language, they might use an interpreter, they might finger spell, they might read. So that's how Cheryl and I, we identify, because obviously we can't use our ears, we can't hear, so we have to use a different mode of communication. In order for us to survive in the hearing world, that's how to act. So that's kind of a summary of what it means to be deaf. So now we're going to talk about hard of hearing and that community, and that is anybody who experiences moderate, mild to severe hearing loss. And that requires them to maybe use different technologies such as a hearing aid, an FM system, a variety of apps on their phone they might use in order for them to help hear better, helps them with their communication with other people in a better way. Hard of hearing, the community is a very big community. There's a huge spectrum within that community. You might meet some hard of hearing people who never have been involved with the deaf community at all. And it might go all the way over to hard of hearing people who are really immersed and feel like they're part of the deaf community. So it's a real spectrum on that. So deafblind means it's a person who, there are different experiences with their hearing loss and their vision loss. So the requirement modes for those people are very different. Sometimes it can be tactile, sometimes it can be close view, sometimes it can be braille. And again, that deafblind community has a huge spectrum. You might meet a deafblind person who is completely deaf and completely blind, all the way over to someone who has some hearing loss and some visual loss. So it's a full spectrum there as well. The reason that I'm talking about those three different groups and those three different terms is because often people think that all people within the deaf community are the same, and that's really not true. So every person has different life experiences, has different kinds of communication modes that they use, has different kinds of struggles that they go through. So if you're working with any person who's deaf, make sure that you get a sense to know that person. Don't just make an assumption about what they might need or what kind of accommodations they might ask for, because every person varies and every person's different in their experience and their needs. So for example, Cheryl and I, we have different needs, obviously, right? Some things are similar, but I think this is actually a good time to maybe turn it over to our friend Cheryl, and she can talk a little bit about her life experience as a deaf person So Cheryl, are you ready? Yes, okay, yes, I'm happy to be here today. And I do want to share, first of all, I want to explain a little bit more about myself. I was born deaf. I have CP. I worked for OCHN for 3 years now, and I train teams, general clerical teams. My goal is to be able to teach more people about the deaf culture and how to interact with people who are deaf and hard of hearing. And I wanted to explain a little bit about my life experience. My mom found out that I was deaf when I was 3 years old. The doctor had told her, don't teach her sign language. She'll never learn to speak. She'll never learn to work and survive out in the hearing world. And so my mom listened to the doctor. And so I entered an oral program, and I was there for a long time until I was 12 years old. And that was when I finally learned sign language, and I was very happy to do that. It was a lot better than trying to read lips, trying to understand what people were saying, because while you're reading people's lips, it can be very confusing. A lot of things look the same on the mouth as people are speaking. So you might think somebody's using one word, but they're using something different. So it causes a lot of confusion, a lot of missed information about what's being talked about. So I grew up in a hearing family, and that was really tough because my family never learned sign language. So it was really hard to communicate. There was a lot of challenges and a lot of barriers, but we had a lot of problems as I was growing up, and I thought it wasn't fair that family would sit around and be having dinner or talking, and I felt left out. So I would ask, what does somebody say? And the response would be, oh, I'll tell you about it later. So I felt very left out. I didn't know why people were laughing, or I didn't know what the jokes were. I missed so much stuff because I wasn't able to be involved in the family conversation, and I felt really hurt about that. So, and I tended to be the last person to know things that were happening in the family. Like if there was an emergency that happened, usually I would be the last person to be told. Everybody was talking, and then they would sort of forget to include me in the conversation. And then later I was like, I didn't know that. I didn't know what was going on with that person. Nobody ever told me. Why didn't you tell me? And they'd say, oh, well, I just thought it wasn't a big deal. And I was like, no, I should know too. That's not fair. So now I would really like to turn it back over to Dylan to continue with his presentation. Thank you. Thanks, Cheryl, for explaining about your experiences growing up. I think it's interesting that we share some commonalities and some differences. So for example, I was born in 1991, and my parents thought that I was fine. I seemed normal. And then both my parents are teachers. So they were very aware about the importance of the milestones in language development. And they started to notice that I seemed a little bit delayed with my language development. So maybe about 12 months old, my parents started to notice something doesn't seem right. So they took me in for various tests and finally found out that I was deaf. I was about 15 months old when they identified that. So from there on, I started to learn sign language. And ASL is really my native language. I'm really blessed. And the other thing that I was provided for, my parents both learned sign too, because my aunt signed, my grandma signs, my cousin signs. I think that's a huge reason that my family was, because they're able to sign. So our family already had deaf friends prior to my being born. So my parents were already aware of the deaf community, and they knew deaf people who had jobs and families, and they signed all the time. So when I was born, my parents already had an awareness of what to do. And I think that was really the key. And that's what this training is just to try and increase people's knowledge about the deaf community, because I think there are so many myths that are out there and so much misinformation about the deaf community. And that really can cause a lot of harm to deaf people. So I wanted to ask Cheryl one more question, if you don't mind. So you had said that you have CP, right? So I'm just curious, so with CP and deafness, as those things overlap, do you think that that changed your experience? Yes, yeah, I definitely do. I wanted to, I think the deaf group, you know, deaf community has lots of different views, lots of different opinions. For me, with a person with multiple disabilities, it's really tough because, you know, both kids hearing, hard of hearing, deaf kids tend to judge because I'm a little bit different than they are. I was born into a hearing family, and so I'm not the same. And a lot of kids picked on me as I was growing up. Thought I was dumb, I was handicapped, I was disabled, I didn't know anything, all of these different things. And I really had to prove myself and my intelligence. Fortunately, I learned to read when I was pretty young. So a lot of times what I would do, I would read, and if I didn't understand a word, I'd go to a dictionary and look it up and say, oh, that's what that means. So we don't hear the everyday words that other people just pick up through listening. We have to actually go through and find it, and we have to learn from another person, either through a sign or we have to read. So there's a different way that we approach that. And I did experience language delay because, again, my parents didn't understand I was deaf until I was 3 years old. And then my parents didn't know anything about deaf culture. They had never been exposed to a deaf or hard of hearing person, so they really had no idea. And I really wish that my parents had taken the time to learn more about deaf culture. But unfortunately, that happens to a lot of deaf and hard of hearing people. Their parents don't really get involved. They're not interested in learning or understanding more about where we're coming from. So yeah, I'll switch it back over to you then, Dylan. Thanks, Cheryl, for explaining just about some of the overlaying things that you see. I think a lot in the deaf community, there's a lot of interaction between how, like you said, deaf and people who have multiple disabilities. They maybe sexual orientation, race, socioeconomic, you know, there's so many different layers that can change our lives and our experiences and how we identify. So I think the point of our discussion today is really to show that we're really diverse within the community. Everybody shares some commonalities, but there's a lot of differences. One thing I do want to add to Cheryl's comments about many deaf people have hearing families, that's really true. The research has shown that 90% of deaf people have hearing parents. So, and then what's more shocking than that, only about 15% of those hearing parents know sign language or are able to communicate with their deaf child. So that means then 85% of deaf children grow up in homes without language. So think about what a kind of an impact that would have on a deaf child. Their ability to grow and thrive in school and in employment. And that statistic always is just really heart-wrenching for me. And I always wonder why it's such a small percentage of hearing parents that are able to communicate clearly with their deaf child. Yeah. Interpreter switching.
Okay, hopefully this will work. Okay, just 1 second. I'm not sure if this has sound, but I know that it has captions. So let's see. This is just a very short video, and it explains how not all deaf people are the same. I love this video because it shows the diversity within deaf people. It's just 3 minutes. It's a very short little video.
Like myself, who is late deaf, and I am deaf in one ear and hearing in the other. So for me as a deaf person, sometimes hearing, but it's not one or the other. And I was born deaf, but that way I was deaf in one ear, so it's hereditary.
I'm the youngest of 5 siblings. The 3 youngest are deafblind.
I switch between deaf and disabled because I'm also a little person.
Being deaf is being part of who I am, but that's not my only identity. I'm a person of color, biracial, out of black, out of white, and white.
This is the condition I have. It's called Usher syndrome. It's a hearing and vision loss. I grew up.
A lot of people consider me hearing.
People do call me a hearing effect, but I'm not. I'm deaf. People think being deaf is a bad thing, but I see it as a positive thing. The culture, language, and history made me who I am today.
The deafblind community, tactile ASL, the use of space, the culture, all became a part of it.
Do they know?
Education used note takers. I didn't have interpreters because I didn't know. I didn't know until I was 15. I used English and was mainstreamed throughout high school.
I went to a public school in the morning, then a deaf school in the afternoon. It was the best world. The instructors used ASL, which I found to be more inclusive. I was in both deaf and hearing classes. I wore that bilateral hearing aid cinched across my chest. Very unpleasant.
I got a cochlear implant when I was 15 and went through intensive speech therapy. In high school, I would take the far right.
In large group discussions where there's dynamic conversation, I use interpreters.
I volunteer captioning and interpreting together. I want more of a long-term designated interpreter. Someone who knows me well, who knows my well. As a good person, I want my interpreter's voice to match me. My culture can't be overlooked.
People automatically think that we're all the same, but that's not true. We have layers upon layers. You must have an open mind and everything.
Okay, hopefully you enjoyed watching that video. It's just a very simple little video with so much information. So there's a few things I wanted to add about that video. The first, the FM system. There's a box with wires and earplugs, and I use that all the way through elementary school. And I always got in so much trouble because I would be fooling around. I'd pull out the earplugs. I'd be swinging the wires around like I would do karate with them. And so that was one of the fun memories I had with the FM system. Cheryl, yes. I'd like to add to that. I was a bad girl too in elementary school. I hated that FM system because it was very uncomfortable. It was really hard to wear. So sometimes, you know, there would be these really strange noises in my ears that I couldn't understand, but they required me to wear this FM system. So I was a bad girl. I would take off the FM system and then they would have to call the guy to come and repair it because I didn't want to wear it. So I would like open it up and do stuff with the wires. So I was the same as you, Dylan. I did bad stuff with my FM system. Dylan speaking. One man in the video said, when you meet a deaf person, it's very important to be open-minded. Open your heart, open your mind. So that's the key when you're interacting with any deaf person. Make sure that you are open-minded and that you ask. Asking is the key. Don't assume what the deaf person needs. Ask. How can we make our relationship successful? What type of communication is going to be successful for the two of us? It won't hurt to ask. It's so important. And deaf people really appreciate it when you ask, because oftentimes hearing people make the decision for us without asking us. So asking is key. Yes, go ahead, Cheryl. One more thing I would like to add. I've had the experience in a restaurant with the family when they would order for me without even asking me what I wanted to eat. They would just order for me when I was a little girl, and I would think, I don't even like that kind of food. You don't know what I want to eat. You should ask me first. But they didn't. Typically, they just would go ahead and take control and not even ask me what I wanted to eat. So that was one thing I just wanted to add. So thank you, Dylan. Oh, thanks, Cheryl. Interesting, right? I think that that's something that we have to be very aware of, how our deaf people are raised and their life experiences. That can cause us to be more sensitive when in specific situations. So for example, Cheryl's talking about how oftentimes she felt left out during her experience at the dinner table when she was growing up. I had a family who signed, but sometimes I felt left out as well. When I felt left out at work later or in different environments, that hurt because it was like a flashback almost to the times when I was raised and was left out of family conversations. So sometimes we really stand up and advocate for our communication access because we remember how that feels and how that felt to be left out during those crucial conversations or something that a very intimate conversation that we may have been left out of during childhood. Any questions so far? Anything at all? Let me check the chat and the comments. Hang on. Oh, okay. I didn't realize that. Oh, I didn't realize there were so many comments in chat.
I will say I'm trying to answer the questions as they come for you, if I know the answer.
Oh, thank you, Tricia. Thank you. That's perfect. Okay, yes, ASL. That's right. American Sign Language. Yep. Tricia, you're doing a good job. Thank you. All right, perfect. Okay, let's talk about how many deaf people live in the state of Michigan. There are some statistics out there, and the most recent statistics from 2019 are that the state of Michigan, an agency called the Division on Deaf, Deafblind, and Hard of Hearing, that is a department under the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. And their statistics say about 733,000 people with some type of hearing loss live here in Michigan. Now, in that group, about 45,000 deaf people identify as deaf. And the reason that I use that statistic is because so many hearing people say, I don't see deaf people. I don't see deaf people because we are very invisible. We're not easy to spot. Because when you compare us with people that have other disabilities, their disabilities are more visible. What I mean is people that might use a wheelchair or people that use a white cane. They're easier to spot. They identify easier than I would, right? Now, I know you love Starbucks. I'm addicted to Starbucks. So if I go to a Starbucks and you and I are in line together, if you have never met me before, you might not assume that I'm deaf, right? Until I got up to the barista and we started communicating. I might be using gestures or I might use my iPhone and type something out on notes, and it wouldn't be until that second that you knew that I was deaf. So deaf people are sort of invisible. Basically, Michigan, we have a lot of deaf people. And that's why it's important for your organizations to be prepared now. Be prepared now, or provide access regardless of whether or not you know there's a deaf person coming in, because there are always deaf people out there. So if you wait until the last minute and a deaf person comes up and they say they need something, don't wait. Start providing accommodations now. So don't wait for the deaf person to show up. Oh, yes, Cheryl, I'd like to add one thing to that. I am impressed with my organization because when I was first hired in, they provided a video phone for me, a VP, and that means deaf and hearing people talk through an interpreter over a video phone. Dylan will explain more about that very soon, but I was provided a video phone and that was wonderful. Yes, I would like to applaud your organization. They hired a deaf employee, and that's amazing. That's wonderful. I think it's important for all organizations and businesses to really provide opportunities to all people, because all people have a different perspective, and that's what they provide to an organization. And when an organization has so many people with different perspectives, your business will be successful. So I'd like to applaud your organization. I see Tricia has her hand raised. Do you have a question, Tricia?
We have a question in the chat that I couldn't Google.
Okay, good. Good. I'm doing my job here. Let me see what it says. Oh, okay. Saying how many different languages are in sign language? Oh, that's a great question. And actually, I'm going to talk about that right now. So there are over 200 different sign languages in the world, meaning if I would visit a different country and meet another deaf person from that country, I would be lost just like you would, right? Because their signs look very different than American Sign Language. So for example, I have a friend who lives in England, and the two of us still are in contact, you know, once in a while through FaceTime. I use American Sign Language, ASL, and my friend who lives in England uses British Sign Language, BSL. So I'll give you an example of how they're very different. The two of us still use English, but he uses British Sign Language. So my name is fingerspelled in American Sign Language, and it looks like this, D-Y-L-A-N. Okay, I'm using one hand. Now, if I was talking with my friend and I was using British Sign Language, this is what my name would look like, D-Y-L-A-N. So you can see there's a huge difference, right? It's very different. So I think that that is one big myth. People think, oh, ASL is universal. It's an international sign language, and it is not. It's not. Each country has their own distinct sign language that's different than American Sign Language. Oftentimes when deaf people meet each other, we just naturally gesture, because we already are visual people. So even though someone is from another language, or another country and has a different language, it's much easier to connect. I hope that answered your question. Now let's talk about language specifically. Obviously, American Sign Language is our native language. And one huge myth that people have is that ASL is gestures only, or some type of coded language for English, and that is not true. American Sign Language is an actual language. It has its own grammar and its own grammatical rules. For example, in English, you would say, I went to Ireland a year ago. So now you can say that in ASL, you would say it like this. Last year, me go finish Ireland. That would be the English gloss for that. So you can see that it's very different a very different grammatical structure. So that's why when you are listening to an interpreter, sometimes you hear something like a little bit of processing time or a little bit of a lag time. Sometimes our American Sign Language ends differently, and you have to say the words first in English, so you're actually changing the sentence from English to ASL, like that. So sometimes the interpreter needs time to process that and to catch all of the content prior to being able to translate that into a full sentence. So sometimes you might hear a little bit of a lag, or the interpreter has to say, hang on, I need to back up a little bit and ask what the deaf person what they're saying. So there's that.
Interpreter switch. So ASL is a complete language on its own. And then another thing that I was talking with Cheryl about a couple of days ago, she made a comment, something like, do interpreters add or do interpreters make exaggerations to the sentence? Do you remember we were talking about that? And I want to clarify, interpreters never add any more information. But sometimes the English word that's chosen is not the same thing that's in sign language. We don't have a sign for that. So an interpreter will have to sort of explain or maybe modify or explain what the meaning is from English into ASL. And sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes ASL, we have many slang terminology or idioms. And Cheryl said, yeah, so an interpreter will see that and say, oh my goodness, there's 2 signs that could mean something, maybe 10 different English words. And so that's why sometimes the interpreters need some time in order to translate that so that they can proceed. So Cheryl, you have something to say? Yeah, one example for a slang word is something that's in American Sign Language saying train is already gone, and people don't understand that in English. So I'll explain what that means is you've missed something in a conversation. If you're talking and somebody says, what was that? And you say, sorry, train's already gone. You missed the conversation. You missed what we were talking about. Too bad. And so that's what that means. Yeah, exactly. That's a really good example. So now I want to talk about the community itself. The deaf community is pretty small, but we typically, most of the time, and I say that typically, we tend to be pretty close. So we're considered a collective. It's more of a collectivism, different than the hearing community, which tends to be a little bit more individualist. So within the deaf community, we're very reliant on our interaction, our social interaction, which is why we have a lot of deaf clubs. We'll have, there's one in Detroit, there's one in Flint, there's one in Grand Rapids, there's one in Traverse City, there's one in Saginaw. So there's a variety of places where we can come together and we can make a lot of noise as much as we want. We don't have to worry about hearing people and what they're thinking about us. It's really where we can go and just be ourselves. And that's where we really share information among each other. We provide some emotional support to each other because, like Cheryl had said, many deaf people don't get the emotional support that they need from their families. So instead, we often rely on our community for that support. And actually, our community parallels with a lot of other minority communities, like an LGBT community. Many other minority communities have similar aspects. Our beliefs and our values, one huge thing that we don't necessarily feel like, we don't feel bad about the fact that we're deaf. We are very accepting of that. We are what we are. We don't necessarily want to change who we are. So we typically are pretty positive in our identification about deafness, about ourselves. Behaviorally, maybe you've noticed some behavioral differences. So eye contact is one thing, very important, because obviously with ASL, it's a visual language, which means we are very accustomed to keeping eye contact with people and being able to interact that way. And sometimes that feels a little bit odd for hearing people. So it's very normal for us to have more direct eye contact. We're very comfortable with touch often. So for example, if I wanted to get Cheryl's attention, I would maybe tap her on the shoulder. To some hearing people, they feel like, why are you touching me? But that is a cultural thing. That's a cultural norm for deaf people to touch, maybe hug each other. Now through Zoom or through some kind of video platform, sometimes I'll wave right in front of the camera in order to get attention. So that's how a behavior change that's happened. Cheryl, you have a comment? Yeah, also another thing I wanted to add, sometimes if a coworker is trying to get in touch with me or get my attention, if I'm in a room, maybe I'm in the cafeteria or something and you're trying to get my attention, you can flip the lights on and off. And if those go on and off, and a lot of times I'll look over to see what's happening. So that's a good way to get attention. So there's lots of different ways, If there's a wooden floor, if you pound on the floor with your foot, I'll feel the vibration. And that's what tends to get my attention. So there are lots of different ways to get a deaf person's attention. I was a bad girl. So I used to crinkle up paper and throw it at people. And people would say, oh, it wasn't really very nice. But if a person was far away and I didn't feel like getting up and walking across the room, I would do that. So sometimes with a disability, I would, use different techniques to get people's attention. Okay, back to you, Dylan. Thanks, Cheryl, for adding into that. Another thing that we don't feel, nobody feels nervous about tapping a person. Sometimes hearing people will use one finger. It's like, it's okay. You can use your full hand to tap me. It's not going to hurt. It'll be fine. I think that's kind of a funny thing. So I think just be aware when you're working with deaf people, not to freeze, not to feel, if somebody's looking at you or if they touch you, deaf people will look at that and say, obviously you're not comfortable around a deaf person. So if you can feel like you're aware of what's happening, you might be more comfortable. Art. I love art. I could talk about art all day, but unfortunately, there's not enough time permitting for that. So we use art in order to express our accomplishments, our struggles, and I'll give you a couple of examples of that over the next couple of slides to see what I mean. So where we pass on some of our literary traditions, folklore stories, jokes that get passed down, those pass down values and teaching to younger generations on how to survive in the hearing world. So I want to give you a little bit of a deaf joke, explain. It's a pretty simple, cute one. So there's a man and he works in a forest. He's a woodcutter. So he works all day long, and if he sees a tree, he'll go up there with his axe and he chops it down. And then he'll holler, timber, and then the tree falls down. So he works all day chopping trees down, and at the end of the day, there's this really huge, big tree, wonderful tree. So he starts chopping the tree, and he hollers, timber, and nothing happens. So he tries again, hollers, timber, and the tree just stands there, nothing happens. So he calls a tree doctor, and the doctor comes out and he looks at the tree and he evaluates it and he says, well, this tree is deaf. And the lumberjack says, really? What am I supposed to do? And the doctor says, well, you have to finger spell timber. And the guy says, well, okay. So he looks it up on his phone, how to do that. And he said, oh, I learned some ASL now. Timber. And the tree falls down. So that's just kind of a simple but short deaf joke, one of the examples that we tell in the community. History is another thing. So basically, we've existed since caveman times. So we have a long history, people who are deaf, but connected to language in the early 1800s through to the early 1900s, that 100-year time, America didn't have any deaf schools. There was a man named Gallaudet, and he was a pastor. He saw a little girl who was playing by herself. She wasn't interacting with any of the other kids, with her siblings, and she seemed kind of sad. So Gallaudet went up to her father and said, what's the matter with her? And her father said, she's deaf and dumb. We can't do anything with her. And Gallaudet said, I'm really not satisfied with that answer. And he said, would you mind, that family actually was very wealthy, and he said, would you give me some money to see if we can help her? And they said, sure. So they gave some money to Gallaudet, and he started doing some research and found in France there was a huge, very well-respected deaf school. So he went, took a cruise liner over to France, and he met a deaf teacher that was there, whose last name was Leclerc. He signed very fluently, and he looked around at the kids that were all playing around, and they were all signing. They were able to read and write. They had very normal lives. They saw a deaf teacher. He was earning a good income. He had a house. And he said, Gallaudet said, I need to bring this approach back to America. So we're very thankful for Gallaudet that he convinced Clerc to come back as well, move into America, and they together built the first deaf school, which was in Connecticut, called the American School for the Deaf. And from that point on, that was finally where deaf children were able to come in and be together. And so that's where ASL really started to take off, because you had kids from all over the country, and they each had their own gesturing systems, home signs, and maybe some Native American sign language, plus some of the French sign language that Clerc brought. And so those all merged together over time, and that became ASL. So that's why if you compare American Sign Language to French Sign Language, they're actually fairly similar. Not exactly the same, but you can see where it comes from, you know, where ASL was inspired from. All right, so now you can see some of the art. This artist is Mary Thornley. So I wanted to actually talk to people now that are out there in the audience. Can somebody tell me, what do you see here with this? What do you feel when you're looking at this painting? What do you think this painting is trying to say? What message is it trying to send?
I'll say something about it. When I look at this, I see people maybe trying to knock ASL down because you can see the cracks, but it's still obviously standing tall.
Yeah, beautiful. So this is my favorite part of my presentation, because every time I give it, people see the same picture and they get it. They understand, you know, you can see how powerful art is at sending a similar message. And you're exactly right. So the story behind this painting, in the 1880s, around then, there was a huge conference in Milan, Italy. So it was about deaf education. Prior to that, sign language in education was very acceptable and was very encouraged. Unfortunately, during that conference, some old white guy decided, hey, nope, this isn't going to happen. ASL, sign language, is a bad idea. So all deaf children have to learn to be able to speak and lip read, and that's it. No sign language would be allowed. So that decision during that conference still has a big impact on us today. Can you imagine that? This conference was in 1880, and it's still influencing deaf children today. So you can see the ASL is built through years and years and years, but it stood up to oppression, and it still stands there, and it's not gone. And you can see the army kind of behind. They almost look like they have some wings, and that represents the people who have gone by, but their decisions and their influences that are still impacting and influencing our educational system, our life experiences. So yeah, thank you to the person who commented. That's great. And I think the interpreters are switching. So, oh, interpreters, very, yeah, light colored.
Okay, it seems like it has fixed itself again. All right. One more piece of art that I'd like to share with you. So tell me what you see in this artwork. What feeling do you get when you look at this? Don't be shy, you guys. Come on.
I feel like the person at the bottom is maybe pining for attention, trying to get attention, but the blue kind of blurred faces are completely kind of in another world than that person and totally closing them off because you can see the crossed arms. So yeah.
Thank you. Again, you captured the exact right sentiment. Yep. This painting is called Family Dog, and the deaf artist's name is Susan Dupour. This is a very powerful piece of art. It represents feeling like the family dog because she said that every family event, like a Christmas party, birthday parties for the family, anytime the family would get to their house, they would just be so excited to see her. They would hug her and pinch her little cheeks, and then maybe 5 minutes later, they just totally cast her aside and talk to the hearing people, and they would say things to her. Oh, we'll tell you later. Don't bother me. Go play. You go watch TV. So the deaf person felt like, wow, what am I, the family dog? So when you look at this painting, you can see the girl at the bottom, obviously, painted to look like a dog. And then next, the yellow coffee table, you see that there in the painting? That represents a fence, representing the division between the hearing world and the deaf world. And then next, you're right, you can see all of the people sitting there with their arms crossed, representing refusal to sign, refusal to communicate. And then at the top, you can see their faces, like you said, blurred, like static on a TV, blurred faces. It's very hard to lip read them. It would be hard to understand those people, and you would feel a huge disconnect. And then their heads look like skulls also, representing, those people are dead to her, that she doesn't care about them. So when that painting first came out, so many deaf people said, wow, that is exactly how I feel. And they felt a huge connection with that painting. One theory that arose from that was called the dinner table syndrome. The dinner table syndrome. So that's what we use to describe our experience and feeling left out during any type of family function, like Cheryl was commenting on today, right? So Cheryl, I have a question for you. When you see that painting, do you feel an immediate connection? Cheryl says, yes, I do. I remember when I was a little girl in elementary school and there was no closed captioning on the TV, and I would watch cartoons and I didn't understand anything they said, but I could see the action and I would catch the action and I would get some basic understanding and the basic idea of what was happening. But when I was a little girl and my parents were watching TV, I never watched with them because I couldn't understand any of it. So I would just go do something else away from the family. And then later in 6th grade, finally, we bought a closed caption decoder because a long time ago, you used to buy a special box to plug and then closed captioning would show up. But my parents at that time refused to add that to the TV downstairs. It was only on the TV in my bedroom, so I could watch TV upstairs. And my parents complained about closed captioning bothering their eyes, and they would rather have that turned off. So I didn't think that was very nice, and it really wasn't very respectful, but that's just one example, Dylan. Yes, it's very interesting. I've had almost the same experience with closed captioning, Cheryl. I grew up with closed captioning, but my mom was very strict. All of the TVs had to have captioning on them. Every single TV had to have captioning on because my mom was used to watching closed captioning with me. So when my mom married my stepfather, he kept turning the closed captioning off when I wasn't there. So I would come into the room and it would be so irritating. I would have to turn the captioning on again over and over again. And it like really? Seriously? It was a little bit offensive. So I agree with you, Cheryl. It felt like an insult. So thank you for explaining your perspective. I appreciate it. Okay, let's talk about Audism. It's a similar concept with any ism, for example, racism, Audism, sexism, so those types of things. So really, aud, A-U-D, means focus on hearing and speech. Ism means action of discrimination or prejudice. So really, basically, when one person can either be hearing or deaf, either way, hearing or deaf, but they're against another person because of their ability to speak and their ability to hear and their ability to read and write. Okay, so let me give you one example of my experience with Audism. As I said in the beginning of my presentation, I am a licensed clinical social worker and I work with a variety of people. And it just so happened that one of my clients needed to see a psychiatrist. My client said, "Hey, Dylan, I'm really nervous. Would you mind coming with me for my first appointment with the psychiatrist?" And I said, "Of course, I would be very happy to go with you to provide support." So we set up this appointment with a psychiatrist with a certified sign language interpreter. And I thought, oh, this is perfect. Everything's going to work out great. So far, so good. So I showed up at the appointment with my client with the interpreter. So things were going great and we were waiting. And the psychiatrist showed up and everyone in the room was there and they introduced themselves. And I was the last person to introduce myself. And I said, "Hello, my name is Dylan." And I gave the psychiatrist my business card and the interpreter was voicing for me. And the psychiatrist looked at me and said, "Wait a minute, why aren't you speaking for yourself?" And I was like really thrown off. And I said, "Well, I'm deaf. Trust me, you don't want to hear my voice. It's terrible. I would much prefer to work with the interpreter." And the psychiatrist said, "That's impossible. That is absolutely impossible. You have a master's degree, right?" And I said, "Yes, I have an MSW. Yes, I do." And the psychiatrist said, "You should know how to speak for yourself." And I was completely thrown off by that. I said, "No, I'm fine. I prefer to use a sign language interpreter." And I said, "Hey, we're here for this patient who needs an evaluation, right?" So the psychiatrist continued to argue with me and ask me all kinds of questions about why I couldn't speak for myself. And I was just blown away by that. So obviously it was Audism. That psychiatrist had already had this view of what deaf people should look like, what deaf people should do. So that really that was a bad feeling for me. It was a bad experience and it was a very awkward situation. And I told my patient after that we needed to find a new psychiatrist. We were done with that one. Oh, goodness. But that's just one example of how we experience Audism every single day. Another example that we experienced recently, because with COVID, unfortunately, some deaf people are saying, "Oh gosh, I don't want to walk inside to any restaurant or fast food place. I would much prefer the drive-through to minimize the risk of exposure, to COVID, of course." And obviously the drive-through is not accessible to deaf people. So some people don't care, they drive through anyway to the window and they have a note and hand it to the person in the drive-through. And some places are wonderful. They understand exactly how to accommodate that deaf person in the drive-through. And other restaurants are like, "Hey, you are disrupting the flow. Other people are waiting. You move ahead. You got to walk inside the restaurant." That's discrimination. It's our decision to go through the drive-through. And I'm sorry if other people have to wait another 2 minutes, maybe 3 minutes. Life is hard. But there are so many examples of Audism that happen to us every single day. Cheryl, do you have any experience with Audism, with oppression that you would like to share? This is Cheryl speaking. I do. I did experience the same thing at the drive-through. Most of the time, I write a note ahead of time, so that it doesn't take forever. I write it first, my order, and then I hand it to the person at the window, and the person takes the note, and, I point to my ear, and I, pat it or point to it with my index finger. But prior to COVID, quite a while ago, I have one story that happened, and it was in, it was in the news about this kid at Taco Bell. He was deaf. And he came to the drive-thru and he was using his phone to order. He had written out his order on the phone, and the person in the drive-thru said, "Nope, we are not accepting that. We're not going to take your order that way on your phone. Absolutely not." So the kid was just, saying it's my right to order in this drive-thru on the phone. So that story made a lot of fast food restaurants really wake up, because, you have to be fair. You have to accommodate deaf and hard of hearing people. We can't order at the speaker box or here at the drive-through window. So taking our order on the phone is one way to accommodate us. So thank you for that, Dylan. I'd like to add to that too. Hearing people have asked me before, how do you solve that issue, Dylan? How do you solve it? Well, you need to think outside the box. You have to be a little creative. It might be hard to find a solution, but there is always a way. There's always a way. So the drive-through situation, one really good example is Starbucks. And obviously I have an obsession with Starbucks. So there are two things that Starbucks done to solve that problem. They have an app that you can order on, so you can order ahead of time on the app, which is wonderful. And then you just drive through. They have my coffee ready for me because I've ordered on the app. The other solution that's really cool is that a lot of local Starbucks, when you drive through there, I don't know what's it called. They have that screen where you see their menu when you pull up the very first place. They have an actual webcam inside that screen where you order, where like the speaker is, so you can wave and point to your ear, and then somebody will pop up. It's almost like FaceTime on this huge menu. So there's this huge face, and you can see, people inside the Starbucks, and they can see me, and I can gesture, or I can write a note and hold it up to the screen. If Starbucks can solve the problem, I think there are other businesses and organizations that can solve the problem too. So yay for them. Thank you, Cheryl, for bringing that up. Any questions? Let me check the chat really quickly. Just one second. Yes, yep. I saw a question from Trisha. Hang on. Yeah. Okay, perfect. I like that. Excellent. Okay. Now I would like to talk about the group of people that call themselves hard of hearing. I am not hard of hearing. I am not an expert in the field of hard of hearing, but I'm going to try my very best to describe their experience. So this is an audiogram that you see here on the PowerPoint. So deaf people, all of us have the experience of having our hearing tested, and oh my goodness, we get so tired of it. It happens annually. In school, we have to have this audiogram, the test. I never understood why we had to have a test every year. What did they think, that we were just going to wake up one day and be hearing? I didn't understand that part, but they had to show a progressive hearing loss, I guess, because my hearing just got worse and worse and worse. So you can see this picture, and it's the degree of loss, and there are numbers down the side vertically, -10 to 100. I am at the very bottom at 100. I guarantee you I am profoundly deaf, just like Cheryl. She's profoundly deaf too. So, and then you can see the second chart there, and it shows different sounds, like the sound registers. And you see the yellow, it looks like a banana. It's in the shape of a banana, that yellow spot there. That's where human speech is heard, or phonemes. So that's where all of the sounds of human speech are made. Language is made in that speech banana. So many hard of hearing people, many deaf people struggle to understand people because our hearing is below that speech banana. so we can't hear that. So some hard of hearing people just barely squeak by. They, you know, they might be just barely in the speech banana, or some sounds are in the speech banana that they can hear. So maybe like they can't hear Z's or V's or SH's. So when they're trying to understand things, they're missing a lot of concepts, and it's muddled for them. So that's just something to consider.
Interpreter switch. All right, I just wanted to check the chat box too, make sure I didn't miss anything. I don't want to leave the audience out. So when you're working with a hard of hearing person, there's a few things that you should keep in mind. So if you work in a group with people and there's a hard of hearing person within that group, make sure you set up communication rules. And that really can apply to deaf-blind people as well. So it can be applied generally. So communication rules, what does that mean? So maybe if you're in a staff meeting with Cheryl, maybe there's a sign language interpreter that's still there, but it's still a good idea to have communication rules established, such as someone will say one person speak at a time. Which means lots of people aren't overlapping, because that can be really tough, especially for the interpreter to keep up with lots of different conversations happening. That kind of thing is a communication rule. Another thing would be to make sure to find a quiet place to talk where there's less background noise. That way the hard of hearing person can understand you better, not have to fight with all the other noise. A key thing is looking at each other, you know, eye contact, not kind of looking around. We're visual, so we need to see your face. We need to see how your mouth moves and your facial expressions. Try to speak a little bit louder, but don't shout and over enunciate, because that actually makes it worse. So just raise your volume a little bit. I think it's kind of a one funny story about that. I grew up, my mom sometimes would roll her eyes at hearing people when a hearing person was trying to talk to me. And I would say, Mom, why are you being so rude? And I was like, no, that person was yelling to you. They don't understand that you're already deaf. That's not going to help at all. And I was like, oh, really? They're yelling? I was like, oh, okay. I had no idea. So speak as normally as possible, speak at a normal pace. Don't speak too fast or try to slow it down too much. That actually changes the way that your mouth moves, and it's harder to lip read. Be patient, be positive, try to relax. You know, if you're trying to communicate with us, you'll see, oh yeah, it's really not that hard to communicate with us. The last thing, like I said in a couple slides before, always ask what our preference is. How is it best to communicate? How to make the experience good for both of us? Always ask, it doesn't hurt. So I think I went through some of these already. Sometimes facial hair, beards or mustaches, nerves, if somebody has a lisp, sometimes it's a little bit harder for people to lip read. So just be aware if you have any of those things. We will work with you to make sure it's clear, but also understand that only 30% of people are really able to understand lip reading. So lip reading is a lot of guesswork. It's kind of a puzzle that we're trying to fit in. We have to try and put all the pieces together to figure out what you're trying to say. So I don't consider myself an expert lip reader, but I can do some lip reading. So one of the huge things that helps me is if I know the content or the context of what you're talking about. Sometimes I can sort of predict what's going to be said. So for example, if I ask where the bathroom is, I can sort of predict what you might say. And then lip reading becomes a little bit more clear. But if I don't have a contextual idea, or if there's some new information, or if it's something that is impossible to predict, often I'll be lost. I think, Cheryl, you wanted to add something as well? Yeah, oh, just a second. So your slide, a couple slides before, I forgot I wanted to add something. No, I'm sorry. Go ahead and finish the hard of hearing part, and then the deafblind part too, and then I'll add my comment at the end of that. Okay, sure. Yeah. Yep. Don't forget. Yep. Don't forget your comment, because I do have something important to discuss. We have something important to discuss too, right? So other things, you can test this out with your friends or your partner or whatever. If you're saying these two different sentences that I have up there, so if you're trying to lip read, you'll see, oh my goodness, wow, both of those sentences look exactly the same on the mouth. So that's how easy it is to misunderstand things. And again, I can't speak, so I can't show you the difference, but you can practice. So in summary, I really like this example. So you can see, don't cover your mouth with your hands. It's hard for a hard of hearing person to be able to lip read if you're covering your mouth. And it's good now because, again, with COVID now, you don't want your hands around your face anyway, right? And Cheryl says, yeah, actually, I would like to add one thing. So with COVID now, there are a lot of deaf and hard of hearing people who are really struggling because everybody's wearing a mask and you can't see people's faces in order to lip read. So just want to let people know that a lot of deaf and hard of hearing people are really struggling. And they are making some masks with a clear part, but when you breathe, it becomes foggy and you can't see. So it's still hard to lip read people with those masks. I just wanted to add that part in. It's an additional challenge. I had gone in, for example, to a store and I was in line waiting to pay for my food. And a woman came up and she was talking to me and I didn't realize, and she had a mask on. And she kept looking at me and kind of making facial expressions. And I was like, I can't hear. And this went on and on and on. And she kept looking at me and I was like, I can't hear. And I was gesturing and she finally pulled her mask down and talked to me. And I was like, okay, well, I'm not sure that really helped, but just one example of the frustration. The cashier sometimes talks to me and I'm not even aware. So there's a lot of barriers right now. I just wanted to add that in so people are aware. Okay, Dylan, back to you. Yes, I had the same experience with masks. I think there was one person at a store somewhere, I don't know, a grocery store or something. And I said, I can't hear and I couldn't see because of the mask. So can we gesture or write? And this woman immediately pulled her mask down and started to speak to me. And I was like, no, don't put the mask down. Please don't do that. So yeah, so this is kind of a little bit about what I was talking about. So if you're working with a deafblind person, what can you do to make sure that the communication is effective? So comfort with touch is necessary because that's how the deafblind person knows where you're standing or sitting. And that's their primary way of communicating because many deafblind people use what's called tactile interpreting. What that means, I'll give you an example. So if I'm a deafblind person, I'm using my hands and I'll put my hands on another person as they're signing. So for example, if I'm deaf, there's a deafblind person who's trying to understand me, they'll put their hands on my hands so they can kind of feel what I'm signing. It's pretty cool. So some guidelines to make sure that you give as much information as you can. Identify yourself, who's speaking. One universal symbol for emergency is to draw a big X on the person's back. So imagine, maybe you're in a meeting with a deafblind person in your office and the fire alarm goes off or something like that happens and you have to leave the building and there's no time to really explain what's happening. You can just do a big cross on the person's back and that immediately lets them know that they have to follow you out for some reason. If you happen to meet a deafblind person and there's no interpreter available and they can't see to lip read you, So you can always do writing on the palm. So write out a letter. And so it takes a lot more time, but that is a good way to communicate. So make sure you're familiar, keep the same routines, set meetings up in the same room, things like that. So it's a lot easier for the deafblind person to go through. So they don't have to relearn the layout every time they're meeting you. So now I want to talk a little bit about federal laws and state laws. And thank you. We're really grateful to these 4 legislation pieces that give us equal access rights. These laws, even though they're in place, we still experience a lot of discrimination, but we're really grateful to them to provide us some opportunities. The first 2 are federal laws. So I want to focus on the second one, the American with Disabilities Act. So that was a huge, really wonderful piece of legislation that allowed interpreters to be used, because without that legislation, I wouldn't be able to do my job. I wouldn't have been able to go to college, because that law provided us with the right to request sign language interpreters as an accommodation. So within the ADA law, it says the person has to be a qualified sign language interpreter. So qualified is kind of a vague term. So that's why we also have a state law, which is the last one, called the Deaf Persons Interpreter Act. And so that defines what it means to be qualified. So in our state, here in Michigan, qualified means a certification. So Christine and Helen, the interpreters for today, have to go through and take college courses. They have to go through training in order to pass a state or a national level exam. And actually, both of them have national level certifications. So that's an important thing to be aware of. So speaking of using sign language interpreters, how does that work? So here's some examples. If you have a client, or maybe Cheryl is requesting to have a sign language interpreter, please provide them. Don't ask questions. Don't say, well, what about if we do this instead? If the person asks, it means they know that they need an interpreter. I get so tired when a hearing person says, well, why do I have to do that? Really? Do I have to do that? No, just, we're not uncertain about it. If we ask, it means that we know that we need an interpreter for communication access. Please make sure if you have a meeting, maybe a person is hearing, maybe your patient is hearing, but they have a deaf parent or a sibling that's going to be involved, an interpreter should still be involved, because we don't want anyone to feel left out. Anytime you feel like communication is not very clear and you feel like, nope, you can go ahead and have an interpreter come in, because once in a while a deaf person is afraid to ask for an interpreter because they're afraid of discrimination. So sometimes they don't ask. And so you can say, I think we need a sign language interpreter, and that's your right as well. Interpreter switch.
Cheryl, do you have any comments to add to this? Yes, I do. I would like to add to that. Also, some people misunderstand, and they try to use people who just know a tiny bit of sign language and are not really qualified interpreters, because, you know, they might know very basic signs or just not enough signs to keep up with the speaker, or, you know, something like that. Also, I've had the experience at my work where I didn't have an interpreter, and instead they would give me a laptop with closed captioning, and it would come across in English with captions. So that helped, but the negative thing about that was that it kept freezing, or it would turn itself off, or, you know, something like that. So that was one problem, but that's another technology issue. If another technology you could use if there's no interpreter available. Oh, thank you, Cheryl. Yep. Cheryl made a really good point about relying on coworkers who know a little bit of sign. that's not a great idea. You know, if they know basic signs, you know, if you want to tell Cheryl something really simple, that's fine. But in a meeting, bring in a qualified interpreter. So my boss, who's a wonderful, wonderful boss, she is a certified interpreter as well. But any important meeting we have, we still hire interpreters, qualified interpreters for me, because my boss, you know, wants to be a boss in the meeting. She can't be both. She doesn't want to have a dual role of being my boss and my interpreter. She doesn't want the stress about, you know, thinking about the agency plus making sure that her deaf employee has access. Those are two overlapping jobs. So what Cheryl is saying, she makes a really good point. You know, her co-worker, let them be Cheryl's co-workers as opposed to burdening them with the added duty of being the interpreter as well. Good point, Cheryl. Writing is not always effective in forms of communication. Writing including texting, chatting. It's okay for something very, very basic, like a very basic conversation, and emailing is fine, but it's not good for big meetings like this presentation. Can you imagine if I had to type everything? Would you want to read everything that I typed? Absolutely not, right? You want to listen. That's the same for Cheryl and I and other deaf people. We don't want to read everything. So it's very nice to just relax and be able to take in our native language visually. I was talking with Cheryl a few days ago, and she said that there's captioning for any virtual meeting, for any platform. And she said that's fine, but one negative thing about that is that the captioning doesn't always say who's speaking. So sometimes Cheryl feels lost. You know, she doesn't know who made the comment. Or sometimes the captioning misses things, right, Cheryl? Yes, it does. Sometimes it does. The screen freezes or the captioning stops, or sometimes the other thing, Cheryl speaking, the other thing I'd like to add is that I remember the very first when COVID hit, a lot of the platforms did not have captioning, like Zoom didn't have captioning, and different platforms, different apps did not provide captioning. They didn't have captioning at all. So I had to really, you know, say, please, please, please add captioning with these platforms because I needed to know what they were talking about. And then later, finally, interpreters were added and it got better. But when COVID first hit and we went virtual, oh boy, it was really difficult because there was no captioning. So that's just one example. Yes, this is Dylan speaking. Exactly, yes. Cheryl's saying yes. The other thing that's key to the interpreter is that the interpreter is neutral. They don't change the message. They don't skew the message. They don't add to the message. They interpret what the deaf person says and what the hearing person says, and that's it. So one big misunderstanding, sometimes when I'm presenting, when my presentation is done, people will walk up to the interpreter and say, wow, your presentation was wonderful. And I'm like, hey, hello, that was my presentation, you guys. So that's just one thing that happens. So make sure that you understand that the interpreter has a very important role, but what I say, that's mine. That's all my thinking. Those are all my emotions, all my feelings. So the other thing I'd like to add to that too is that the interpreter is going to interpret everything, and I mean everything. So if you have a tone or if you say a bad word, the interpreter is going to interpret what you said, because that's a code of ethics for the interpreter. The interpreter has to interpret everything. That's our access, and it's equal access. If I could add to that, if I could add one thing to that, Dylan, this is Cheryl speaking, and it's important to remember that when you're working with an interpreter, don't say, tell her that I said. The interpreter is going to tell me everything, and so many times hearing people don't speak directly to me. They speak to the interpreter and say, tell her I said. Yes, Cheryl, exactly right. I agree with that. The other way to make sure that you have effective communication with the interpreter, with the deaf person, is eye contact with the deaf person. So, and again, don't say, tell her, tell him. Don't do that. Just speak directly to the deaf person. Can you imagine that, you know, that I was in person, I was in person and I had an interpreter? Oh, that's a bad example. let's say I'm a hearing presenter, okay? I'm a hearing presenter and I'm speaking. The interpreter should be standing behind me a little bit because the deaf person needs to see the hearing presenter as well as the interpreter, because I can see the hearing presenter's body language and watch the interpreter working for that information and content. Now during COVID times, I'm very impressed with all of the interpreters. I'm sure that you've seen the TV news and all the interpreters on TV, they are standing next to the governor or the mayor or whoever they're standing next to, because we are getting full access in one screen to the hearing person and then the information from the deaf person. So make it a normal pace. Be aware about head nods, So when I nod my head, or anyone in the deaf community is nodding their head, that's just like back channel feedback. It's just like, It doesn't always mean I understand you. Sometimes I'm sort of pretending that I understand you. I might say, I don't understand one single word they're saying, because I don't want to have to ask you to repeat yourself and then you'll yell at me. So I just say, So when you work with deaf people and you see that head nod and you want to make sure that they understand, ask them if they want you to repeat it, if they want you to discuss something that you just talked about before moving on to a new topic. Again, it doesn't hurt to ask. Cheryl, yes, did you have something to add? This is Cheryl speaking, yeah. Oh shoot, I forgot, I'm sorry. Dylan says, oh, I'm sorry, Cheryl. It was something you said before, Dylan, that I wanted to add to, but I've forgotten. Maybe it'll come back to me. Was it about interpreters standing behind the hearing person, or maybe it was TV news? Was that Cheryl? No, Cheryl says nope, it wasn't that. Oh, it'll come. Maybe you'll think of it in a second. Okay, so you can see this chart here, and that is our state law under the Deaf Persons Interpreter Act, and that established standards for interpreters. So you can see that there's a level 1, a level 2, and a level 3. And that's set on a basic risk level. So level 1 is low risk, level 2 is sort of a medium risk, and level 3 means high risk interpreting. So for example, level 1 might be a meeting, a very basic meeting. Level 2 would be a medical situation, a mental health situation. And then level 3 would be something that happened in court. So that law was established because level 1 typically are new interpreters who have less experience interpreting. Level 2 is an interpreter with more experience, and then level 3 is an interpreter with the most experience, because we want to protect the deaf community. We don't want someone who just graduated from an interpreter training program showing up in court. You know, I don't want that to happen either, right? So we just need to make sure that the appropriate interpreter with the appropriate skills is placed into the correct situation. That's what the chart shows you, and I'll send you the PowerPoint and you can take a look at it. I see that Tricia has her hand raised. So Tricia, is there a question?
Yes. When we are requesting an interpreter, should we specifically say level 2 or level 3 depending on our need?
Oh, great question, Tricia. Yep. That's a really good question. You do not have to know that information. The agency will be responsible for that. But when you request an interpreter, make sure that you give as much information as you can about the situation that you're requesting the interpreter for, like where it's going to happen, what's the situation, what is the deaf person's preferred communication mode. That way the agency, hopefully, if you have a reputable, good agency, they will analyze the information that you've given them, and they will pick the appropriate interpreter for that. So, and also as to what the law requires. Again, the law is a minimum standard requirement. So for example, for my presentation, really, I would only require a level 1 for this presentation according to the law. But still, you know, I want someone with a lot of experience to help me on this, you know, to interpret for me. So I would ask for a level 2 or a level 3 interpreter. to interpret for my presentation. So I hope that answered your question. Did it, Tricia?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Perfect. Okay. Okay, so you see this grid here, and this is the certificates. It's very complex. I am not going to explain everything on here because of time constraints, but you see 3 different levels here. You see education, national certification, and state certification. So for here in Michigan, all are acceptable. Some interpreters have all of these credentials. Some interpreters only have 1 or 2 credentials. So really it just depends. In general, the state level 2 or 3 and then national certification typically can work in a lot of different situations. And again, all interpreters, professionals, they're professional. All interpreters are professional interpreters, and all the interpreters have to have training. They need to have training. The interpreters are not my sisters. They're not my aunts. It's not my mother. It's not my friend. They're professional interpreters. So you can check our state website, take a look at interpreter credentials, and I've put the link here, and it's free. It's easily accessible. I would encourage you to check that every once in a while because you want to make sure that the agencies are sending you certified sign language interpreters.
Okay, yeah, so we're switching interpreters. So this is my favorite slide because it explains why it's so important to have an interpreter that has certification. So for example, in this example, the psychiatrist will say, do you feel sad or blue? Do you feel like life's not worth living sometimes? And then if the interpreter says, the doctor wants to know if you feel sad or if you like your life. So do you think that's a good translation of what the psychiatrist asked? Thumbs up or thumbs down? No, thank you. Thank you for your response. You're right. Obviously, the interpreter misses a lot of the message from the psychiatrist. So the second one is a clinician asked, how long does she think that she needs to take these medications? If the interpreter says, she says you should take the medications for 2 weeks and then come back to see him. Do you think that's a good interpretation? No, definitely not, because obviously the interpreter was making a decision for the deaf patient, and that can be dangerous. The third example here is the psychiatrist says, is anything bothering you? If the deaf patient responds and says, oh, you know, I know that God is with me. I'm not afraid because they can't get me. I'm wearing these new pants and I feel protected. I feel good. I don't get headaches anymore. Okay, but then the interpreter responds, he says that he's not afraid. He feels good and doesn't have headaches anymore. Is that a good interpretation? No, definitely not. Obviously, the interpreter dropped a whole lot of information. So sadly, those are actually real situations, things that came from the state of Alabama. They did a mental health questionnaire in a controlled situation, fortunately, but they videotaped. And then during this third situation, the researcher asked the interpreter, why did you change the message? The interpreter was fairly new, and they said, well, when I was watching the deaf person and they were signing, they were all over the place what they were talking about, and I felt really lost. And I didn't want the psychiatrist to think that I was a bad interpreter. So I decided to sort of clean it up and make sure that I sounded like a good interpreter. Ugh. So, you know, that can be dangerous. That's really how it is to have a really good interpreter who has a lot of training. Something that you need to consider when you're hiring interpreters, because you can't just think, oh, I'll just ask an interpreter, that's good enough, I'm done. My job is done then after that. You have to make sure that the interpreter that shows up does a good job. And that interpreter also has to really fit with the deaf client's needs. So as we're kind of getting close to the end of the time, there's a couple of slides that I'm just going to go through briefly. So technology, like Cheryl was talking about, the video phone, is something that we use. We use lots of different technologies, and I'll go through the next couple of slides kind of quickly. So this is what a video phone, or VRS, which is video relay service. That's something that we use on our phones or on our TVs to make phone calls, really to anyone, hearing family members, for ordering pizza, whatever. So it's a really cool technology that we have access to. So another word, so there's video remote interpreting, VRI, and this is where people get confused between the VRS and the VRI. Video remote interpreting is used for something like meetings, like this presentation. So there's the interpreters that are in different places, but they're still providing interpreting services. VRI is and interpreting. So for example, maybe Cheryl will need an interpreter right away, but maybe there's no interpreter available. So VRI is something that can come in handy to maybe get an interpreter that's based in California or Florida to be able to interpret that meeting. There's pros and cons to this. The pros are the access. More people are able to have access. The negatives are that sometimes you don't have a good interpreter. Maybe sometimes the interpreter in California is not familiar with the regional signs, or maybe they've never met Cheryl before, or they've never met me. And so sometimes it can be more of a challenge to interpret for that person. And then there's also technology issues, freezing, things can be blurry. It's not always clear. So sometimes deaf or hard of hearing people use FM system, and this is what that looks like. I don't use these, but people who have some hearing loss will use that. So these are FM systems. So phones, you can amplify just so that the voices are louder. Some hard of hearing people use something called a caption phone. So they can pick up the phone and they can hear the person speaking, and they can speak for themselves, but there's some captioning that's happening on the phone as well, just to support the understanding. So caption call or CapTel. So this is kind of cool. CART is something that I use. I use that pretty often recently for big conferences. So I still ask for a sign language interpreter plus CART services. So that way I can see the English words. Sometimes I go to professional conferences and they're using a lot of jargon and professional words. And so it's nice for me to be able to see the words on the screen that are being used, as opposed to depending on the interpreter to fingerspell everything. So it's kind of a nice bonus. So fire alarms, doorbells. All right, so this is my agency. And before I talk about that, I want to know, does anybody have any questions? I think this is actually a great time. So I questions that you have. And Cheryl, you have something to say? Yes, I could add one more thing before people ask questions. I forgot, after you were talking about Audism, that was the thing I wanted to add something to. So to explain that within the deaf and hard of hearing communities, there's a lot of different oppression that happens, a lot of different discrimination. So there are different groups even within there, people who are born deaf or born to deaf families. Sometimes there's this idea of elitism because they have some privilege. They were able to get their language development very early. They had language access as soon as they were born. And then there are people who are born into hearing families, and what do I want to say here? So, you know, their language tends to be delayed because they didn't start learning right from birth, and especially if a family didn't know how to sign. So language tends to be very delayed. With hard of hearing people, within that group, there tends to be both different technologies used for communication, for speaking, for signing. They use different techniques to communicate, but also that's why I really don't like, you know, sometimes some of the discrimination, you know, it's like, oh, you're not as smart as me because you went to a hearing school and your language skills aren't so great. So, you know, there's a lot of discrimination even within the culture, just the same as there is in the hearing culture. So people are different and there is discrimination within the group. Yeah, thank you, Cheryl. I think that's really sad. I think most of the time we are fairly cooperative and we work together, but there is oppression against each other sometimes. You know, our system oppresses us, and so often we learn to oppress other groups, even within our own people. Just, it makes us feel better sometimes. Sadly, that's true. And then within our community, when we see a person who kind of fits more of the hearing vision, for example, a white male who speaks well and writes well, that's in the deaf community, they tend to have a lot more privilege compared to another deaf person who doesn't have those things. So we see the same problem, you know, that happens in the hearing community as well. So people have more privilege, there's racism that happens, there's a lot of different methods of discrimination, and it happens a lot in minority communities. So Cheryl, that's a really good point. So now we're open to questions.
We do have a few questions in the chat.
Yes, okay. So there was I can't see the full sentence, but the question from Vicky says, how do you know if the interpreter is doing a good job or not? That's a really good question. Sometimes it can be hard, but one of the ways is sometimes you can see if the deaf person's facial expression is kind of like, huh, what are they saying? Sometimes you can tell that means something's not right, it's not clear. Or if you feel like the response is a little bit off, or if you feel like something's missing, that's your hint that it's not going well. So sometimes it's good to try a different interpreter to compare. And it doesn't hurt to ask the deaf person, do you feel like you're getting a good interpretation? Do you feel satisfied? Do you feel like we need a different interpreter? Make sure that you give some of the empowerment to the deaf person too, because they know who a good interpreter is. You know, we talk about that within the deaf community and say, oh, you know, this interpreter is, you know, thumbs up or thumbs down. So, and I have a list of interpreters who I feel comfortable using. So many interpreters have worked with me for a long time because the interpreting process really requires a lot of trust and building a relationship. You have to build rapport with each other. Yeah, Cheryl, did you want to add something? Yeah, can I add, somebody had said, Samantha, in your comment, you don't have to take classes to learn ASL. You can learn online as well. There's lots of different ways that you could learn. You could go to classes, but you could learn online. And one of a really good way to do it is learning from deaf people, other deaf people. They can teach you about their cultural aspects as well as the language. You'll learn more about how to communicate with deaf and hard of hearing people. You'll just get more exposure as opposed to just going in and taking a class. Yeah, and the other thing that I wanted to add is right now, OCC has the program as Dylan's teaching, but a lot of times they want to have people, the students, interact with the deaf community. So they might have deaf socials, and so it's a way to interact. And of course, a lot of deaf people don't have a lot of patience sometimes for slow learners that are just starting to learn to spell. But then there's a lot of other deaf people who have a lot of patience and are willing to work with you and let you try and will teach you more signs. Yeah, that's true. I think you can learn sign ASL through an app or something online, but and I teach as well. And I think you learn the best from a deaf person. If you happen to work closely with Cheryl, I would really encourage you to start a conversation with her. Just say, hi, how are you? Because the more that you use some gestures or try to develop a relationship, you'll notice that you start to pick up things a lot faster compared to if you're trying to learn from a screen or on your phone or watching a video on YouTube. Yeah, I think you really do need 3D. Okay, any other questions? Yes, Trisha says, Cheryl, thank you so much for your patience. Yeah, of course, yeah, she's a wonderful person. Okay, any other questions before I wrap up? Doesn't hurt, there's no stupid questions. I promise I won't bite. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up then and give you a last chance at the end to ask any questions if there are any. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about my agency, my beloved agency. It's a nonprofit agency, and they were established 39 years ago. So they were set up by both hearing and deaf people because there was an awareness that services needed to be offered to the deaf community. And so we've been there ever since. So this is where we're located. We're in Sylvan Lake. A lot of times people look at the map and they say, wow, you just must have this beautiful view of the lake. And I was like, nope, unfortunately, we look at all fast food restaurants across the street from us. So it's not really a very nice view. So all of our services we provide for the deaf community are for free. We have youth programs, we have mental health programs, we have trainings, we have HIV programs. So if you have any deaf people that have HIV, please refer them to us. We have a really amazing program that we run for them. We provide interpreting services. And if you want to learn the alphabet, here's a slide with all of that. And then here's my contact information. Please feel free to contact me through email. You can give me a call, but my preferred, I get hundreds and hundreds of emails. So if you really want to get in touch with me, call me. It'll probably be easier. You'll be more likely to catch me. All right, thank you again for giving up your 2 hours to sit and watch my presentation and listen to Cheryl's comments as well. And Cheryl said, yes, I want to also say, we should have given you a break. I apologize to make you sit for 2 straight hours. Sorry about that. Yeah, sorry, I'm used to no breaks. All right, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Please feel free to ask questions. I have time if you want.
Thank you so much, Dylan. I did put in the chat as well. We are recording this training, so it'll be available on our website within a week.
Great,
it looks like we have a question from Sherry.
Yep, go ahead. Yep, Sherry, go ahead.
Not unmuting. Okay. So my question is there a really good maybe YouTube or some kind of virtual tutorial showing interpreters and presenters how the interpreter can see the person they are interpreting for when the presenter is putting up a PowerPoint? I still haven't seen a really good teaching of this, and I was very frustrated because I didn't know how to make that happen for either the interpreters, for Cheryl, and for myself. I mean, we all, so I was just wondering if the interpreters that were on today, if you had a really good, something you can recommend that I can look up and watch.
Interpreter switch? Yes, okay. There are 2 really good videos on YouTube where they give a tutorial, and they're developed by the state of California. I'm sorry, CSUN, California Southern University, I believe it is, with their office, and they provide instructions on YouTube. And I am more than happy to find that link and email that to Cheryl, and then she can share it with everyone. And to be perfectly frank with you, my organization uses Zoom instead of Microsoft Teams, because from our experience, Zoom is so much better with the controls and the pinning. And that's why in the beginning of our presentation, I struggled, and I think Cheryl would agree with me. This is Cheryl speaking. Yep. We didn't have closed captioning on Zoom before, but they've added it now. So, oh yes, also I would like to add another thing too, that when you're talking about deaf people and deaf events, there are so many different events, deaf camping, deaf dingo. That's like bingo for hearing people, but it's for deaf people. So we have a variety of activities, deaf bowling. There's all kinds of events. So I just wanted to add that. It's not just deaf clubs, but there's a lot of different activities as well that we do, just like hearing people do. We have activities and hobbies. Are there any other questions from anyone? All right. Oh, Sherry, did you have your hand up? Did you want to ask something?
No, I just forgot to take my hand down. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. That's all right. Okay, that's fine. All right. Thanks again, everyone. Thanks for showing up today. I hope you have a very nice afternoon. And again, please feel free to contact me if you have any other questions. This is Cheryl. Also, there's different information and different things too that are related to deaf culture that I've already looked up, and I'll be happy to send those to you. So if you want them, if you want more information, I have different apps and different of maybe different information about deaf culture, all kinds of different things. Just a variety of things that I'd be happy to send to you. So if you want any other information, just go ahead and ask and I'll send it out. Dylan says, perfect, perfect. Trisha? How do I send it to everyone how would I send it to everyone if I don't know their emails?
I can go ahead and send it to everyone. When I also send them a link to the recording, I can send the list of resources and links that you have. Great. Thank you so much, Dylan. Thank you so much, Cheryl. This was amazing. I already have a couple of notes I'm going to bring back to our team, Cheryl.
Perfect. All righty. Great. Yay. Thank you. Thanks so much, Cheryl.
Thank you.
Thank you.